Good afternoon, everybody. Mr. Duffy from home. Still a little sick, but feeling a lot better than I did this morning, definitely, and yesterday evening. So, what I wanted to do was, because I did promise, and I still would like to do review tomorrow, was to kind of wrap some things up here with congressional reconstruction going forward to 1876's presidential election through screencast. And if there's any questions regarding those topics, we can get to those in due time. All right. So if you go to page 495, we'll kind of start there and talk a little bit about Johnson and why Congress sees fit to take as much power as they possibly can from the executive branch, because that's what's really happening in Reconstruction, guys. You have this tug of war, okay, this constitutional tug of war between the executive branch and the presidency and the legislative branch and Congress, okay, and back and forth they go. Johnson's views on Reconstruction are different than a lot of the things that he's decided to actually put into action. In other words, he's talking the talk, but he's not really walking the walk. A good example of that is his vetoes of certain civil rights legislations and things like that we've already seen him do. So in other words, he's not really falling in line with the congressional view of Reconstruction. And he would say, I don't really have to fall in line with the congressional view of doing things. I'm completely different branch of government removed from the needs of Congress, and I'll do what I think is right and what is reasonable for Americans as president, and not as somebody who's sort of tailoring what I'm doing to Congress's needs. So there is just that's sort of a little bit of a defense of Johnson, if it's even worth doing. But one of the things that I thought was important, we'll go back to 495 in a minute, but on 497 at the top, you have a chart that lays out the differences between Johnson, radical Republicans, and moderate Republicans over Reconstruction. And I found this a very good way of clarifying what each's point was for how Reconstruction should be laid out. So, listen, we're reconstructing a really big nation, right, where a lot of hot button issues have come up. We can't expect that they're all going to go away overnight, but I think that on both sides you have problems. Both sides are to blame. If you look at the top of 495, there's an image of a map of the South, and one big aspect of congressional reconstruction was to actually divide the South, not by state, but by military district. So what Congress has basically done is they've used the army that's already there, right? Because the army has been there since the Civil War. They haven't gone home yet, the soldiers, that is. But they're basically, we talked about what martial law is. This is a huge example of martial law, where you don't have states, you don't have districts like you would have in, as far as our state or government's concerned, but by the military. Okay, and that is to ensure a lot of different things. If you go to, I'm still on page 495, but the second paragraph below that image I just was talking about, you have the Reconstruction Acts, otherwise known as the Military Reconstruction Acts, okay, and how it's fulfilled the Radicals' three major objectives. First, they secured the freedmen's right to vote. Second, they made it likely that southern states would be run by Republican regimes that would enforce the new constitutions, protect former slaves' rights, and maintain the Republican majority in Congress. Okay, finally, they set standards for readmission that required the South to accept the preeminence of the federal government and the end of slavery. So they're really holding the South, under their hands, underwater, actually, under their hands, all right, and sort of drowning them in everything the South has traditionally hated, right? Like a powerful federal government and not states' rights oriented governments. The fact that equality of races is so present in the minds of these new governments in the South, that they're absolutely going to be run by Republicans right, who believe in equality. Really hurts. You actually kind of smile a little bit because, South getting away with this for centuries, right? So what I wrote here was, what do these acts actually do? How can it help us define what congressional Reconstruction really was and how it was different from presidential Reconstruction? Listen, at the end of the day, guys, this really just speeds up Reconstruction. One might argue, though, to an unhealthy pace, right? It actually could become a real problem for Congress and for the country because change is okay, but if you try to make change too quickly, it can become a really, really bad thing at the same time. So their intentions are good, but maybe they try to do it a little too quickly too. Maybe the South just fought a war over these ideals that they hold true to. You can't expect them to give it all up in a couple of years, right? Just because and basically you're holding a gun to them. The military is there trying to secure African Americans voting, if that exists, right, in the state, and so on and so forth. So, nonetheless. So, what is Tenure of Office Act? Tenure is the standing you have in a profession that gives you security in your job, in a nutshell, okay? Do you agree with Johnson or Congress on this, was my question, and something that could be a question in the future, right? And I'm still on page 495, Tenure of Office Act, guys, was an act passed by Congress, okay, that made it such that Johnson could not fire any of his cabinet members, any of his secretaries, unless he got congressional approval first, okay? Now, there's a couple different dynamics to this. This is why I'm asking these questions. Do you agree with Johnson or Congress on this? All right? Johnson says, it's my cabinet. I should be able to do what I want with it. All right? Cabinet's not a constitutional thing. It's part of that unwritten constitution. So further solidifying the point that he really doesn't need to have any approval for this. It's ridiculous. Right? Congress, on the other hand, says, well, we still approve cabinet members when you pick them to be cabinet members, so why would we not be able to have some control over you firing them? Just to give you sort of a fast forward for a minute to the 1920s, I actually had to look this case up because I forgot what it was. The Supreme Court case that we'll get to at some point down the line that the Supreme Court finally stepped in and said that this actually was unconstitutional to do this. So the Congress is really not pulling a fast one, that's the wrong phrase to use, but they are definitely trying to get his way with as much as they can. They're trying to take as much power from the executive branch and the presidency as they possibly can and give it to Congress. Okay, so part of Reconstruction is kind of making Congress more powerful, right? A more powerful branch of government, right? Because during the Civil War, the executive branch was hands down the more powerful branch. Lincoln, we don't need to say anything else. I mean, he made that branch very powerful. And now after this, Reconstruction, Congress is looking for some more control. So what happens with this is Johnson, because he disagrees with this act, he actually disobeys it. He ignores it. He fires Edwin Stanton, all right, who is his Secretary of War and was Lincoln's Secretary of War actually during the Civil War. Okay, and what Congress does is because the president has now violated the law, okay, they want to impeach him. Now again, impeach means the process of removal. Okay, he could be removed, all right, if he's found to have committed high crimes and misdemeanors. But he has not, in his mind, done that. But in Congress's mind, he has done exactly that by violating a law they just passed. That was a very controversial law, anyway. Okay. So what happens is, this is the first time this ever happened in American history, guys, as well, we shouldn't hope. But what happens is he is brought up on impeachment charges, it goes for a vote, and Republicans actually decide to vote against the removal of the president. Okay, so he is saved, literally, I think it's by one vote in the end. So he could have been removed, and that would have been just a tremendous occurrence in American history. This was already such a tremendous occurrence in American history, but the Republicans who you think would vote for impeachment and voted against actually have a lot to say about the fact that they are unhappy with what this might do to checks and balances in our system, and that they feel it is unconstitutional. They don't want to hurt the office of the presidency, who's ever there. So there is a lot to be said, guys, about that part of it as well. All right. So counter Reconstruction. So what I put here was, I was thinking about this, is does everyone remember the Reformation, first of all, and the Counter-Reformation from last year, or the year before, right, if you didn't take AP level. The same dynamic applies here. So the Reformation, right, in European history's case, right, was all about changing or reforming religious traditions. And years afterwards, you also had this Counter-Reformation, was to then bring it back to the traditional way. So you have, in this case, and it's convenient for us that they both start with RE, maybe it helps us to remember it. You have Reconstruction, and you have Counter-Reconstruction, all right? And if you go to page 499, okay, you can see the arrow that they're using to denote this is 1870 to 1874. All right, so the question you really want to ask is, what kinds of things are actually happening to make a counter-Reconstruction era possible? And what is known as, what is this thing that's called, what is known as the Solid South, okay? And what is it based on? Because that's, at the end of the day, that's what I'd like you to really kind of think about. Because if you look at, again, page 499, where it says Counter-Reconstruction 1870 to 1874, and you take that until, up until really the end of 501. Now you could even go in further than that. You're seeing that, unfortunately, the basis for the Solid South is really only racism and discrimination. Okay, largely on the done by or done in by or enforced by the KKK, right? And what is, I don't know if it was noted that way in the 1860s and 70s, but certainly today the Ku Klux Klan is among one of the first terror organizations probably in world history, okay? So, the big question to answer there, guys, is for what reasons did this group actually terrorize blacks in the South? How successful were they? Because they were successful, unfortunately. And then what countermeasures, what things did the federal government particularly try to do to stop them from what they were doing? All right? And a lot of it has to do with grant. I mean, there are some measures taken by Congress, like the Ku Klux Klan Act and so on and so forth. But Grant, for example, is running on the campaign campaign line. His line of 1868 election is "Let us have peace." So some people say that he's trying to forward a good and of course peaceful look at where we should be going, and some people say that he was actually turning a blind eye. He wasn't really realistic because he wasn't thinking about what problems actually were occurring. You'd have to kind of look at it and decide for yourself. But grants and graft and corruption, as we're saying here, is really the problem. Now, graft, as it's defined, is using one's position for some other kind of gain. It could be economic gain, more political gain, social gain, whatever it might be. And he did this constantly. Of course, conflicts of interest exist in Congress and now in the presidency too, but they're just rocked by scandal after scandal after scandal. Okay, and what happened was you would have the president, Grant now, right? You would have him give people jobs or give people posts or assign federal monies to certain people that he was friendly with who would do him a favor. Okay, that's graft. Congressmen, senators who would be the CEO, for lack of a better word, for a railroad company, would sign or create bills and sign bills into law that would help railroad companies. Okay, that's a conflict of interest. You really shouldn't be doing that. Now we have laws against that kind of thing, but it's not. It should never have been that way. So, how important was waving the bloody shirt, right, for Republicans and Grant? So, despite all these scandals, Grant still wins re-election. All right, so it just goes to show you how Democrats are still trying to, despite this solid South, despite getting more or regaining more power in the South, They are trying to